Welcome to Crash Concepts, where the economy, energy, and the environment are explored. Up next, fresh ideas and insights into the factors that are driving the world and shaping your future. Presenting information you can't afford to live without, here's Chris Martenson.
Welcome to another podcast with Chris Martenson. I am your host, and today we're talking with Bud Conrad, Chief Economist for Casey Research. We're big fans of the operation Doug Casey has built, and Bud is doing great work there. Bud holds an engineering degree from Yale and an MBA from Harvard, and is also a recent author of the book Profiting from the World's Economic Collapse. So today, he and I are going to discuss his vision for where the economy is headed and what impact he expects the unfolding developments in Japan to have here. Welcome, Bud. It's great to have you today.
I'm looking forward to our discussion, Chris.
Oh, me too. So, you and I think share something of a background. So I say chief economist. I know a lot of people are thinking potentially you're a traditional economist, but you and I share a non-traditional approach to this. And I think the alignment is that both of us understand systems and look at this as a systems issue, and we understand the role of energy and the economy put together. Why don't you talk a little bit about your background, if you could?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. I've long worried about how our economies worked as a sort of amateur when I had a whole career in the computer industry, starting with IBM, ending with Tandem, a company acquired by Hewlett-Packard. But I decided to take up something I would call a personal love to understand how the world works. How is it that these paper systems connect up to each other? And how should we protect ourselves from what looks to be destroying purchasing power of a currency? And I applied my engineering kind of look to create systems approach to understanding how things all connect up. And there's a chapter in my book, chapter 6, that tries to make a bigger picture model of how these all hang together. But of course, in today's crisis, one gets to want to understand how the political system affects the economic system. And the point of all this is to say I'm not a traditional economist that has had the formal education that I think really limits an understanding of how all these things hang together.
Right. So this is exactly the view I have. Much of traditional economics tries to find that perfect equilibrium point. There is one in their minds. If you just pull the right levers, you dump enough money in, something happens, and we get to the right amount of joblessness at 3 or 4%. We've got the right amount of economic growth also at 3 or 4%. That there's some things we can do to twist things around and get to a point of equilibrium. And I'm fundamentally opposed to that idea. I think that we live in a very dynamic world. It's a world of exponential growth. If there's any sort of an equilibrium at all, it's a state of constant change, is how I see it. And the fundamental change that we are addicted to at this point is growth. As long as our debt supply is growing, as long as our money supply is growing, as long as our economy is growing, everything works reasonably well. But there might be a wrinkle in that story. Do you talk about that?
Yeah, of course. Nothing, they say trees can't grow to the sky. Exponential growth can't go on forever. Traders in the marketplace sort of know this intuitively. George Soros writes a book called Alchemy of Finance, including the theory of what he calls reflexivity, which I call feedback loops, which is that when things start to move, say a pendulum in one direction, it'll go right past equilibrium very fast, being the vertical position. In fact, the fastest, going to the extreme. And currency trading, which was his experience, is a good example where things oscillate and move beyond what they could be. People often talk about bubbles. We've just experienced some pretty big ones in our own stock market and real estate. And of course, we get to this business of unsustainability, too, when you move things forever. And the key one behind this that's great in your book, and I think it's wonderful you focused on it, Chris, and it's chapter 2 in mine, is the creation of debt. What has happened is we had an egregious creation of debt, mostly around mortgages, private debt, that grew to an extreme that couldn't be sustained. It was obvious in 2004 and certainly very obvious by 2006 to me that this couldn't go on forever. And, of course, we did have the terrible collapse of particularly housing that we're still facing, and, of course, stock market, too. When you look at charts historically of debt growth in the private sector and overlay debt growth in the government sector, you realize that as the people stop borrowing to buy more houses, the government has now been stepped in to do borrowing and paper over the last crisis. In other words, we've gotten from a position of too much private debt to too much public debt. They have, by throwing a combination of guarantees of something like $10 trillion, papered over the problem of our private sector no longer growing into government debt growing, creating what I've called the eye of the storm that we've been in the last recovery since March 2009. And the government can print up money for a while to make things feel better, but then the government basically loses confidence, or people lose confidence in the government and government debt, just as we lost confidence in Goldman Sachs and private mortgage securitization types of debt. And now we're about to enter a new era where the question of sovereign debt and currency difficulties will take over from the private debt types of problems that we saw with, Lehman Brothers. That's kind of complicated, but to simplify this, we went through a crisis that has became a terrible storm. I think we went through the eye of the storm, and I think we're coming out the other side with things like what we've seen in Greece, Ireland, Portugal as government debt problems. I think our own government is very close to having that. We are past the point of no return on the amount of debt the government has already taken on, and it's taking on even more debt.
Right. So, I see this as sort of, there's a nested set of things occurring here. Some people, and I think mistakenly, say, well, the crisis happened in 2008, and, then we had some responses in 2009. And so they hold that narrow view of saying, look, so there was a little bit of transference from the private side of debt accumulation to the public side. And when things get better, we'll just sort of maybe shift that back again. But if we widen up a little bit, we go back, we could actually start to source, this problem maybe 5 years ago, or 10, or 20. In fact, I see this thing as really, we're living in extraordinary times. This is a moment where we might have to face several generations of excessive debt accumulation and consumption. And it's a painful process of adjustment. What you're calling the eye of the storm, can I characterize that as really an effort to dodge the pain of having to face up to whatever length of period of overconsumption?
Absolutely. I'll put a few more basic points on it. The original currency idea is to have exchangeability for something of value. In other words, gold or silver. We had a bimetallic system. We became the only country standing pretty much after World War II, and the world based its currencies on our currency. We based our currency saying we would stand behind $35 an ounce Bretton Woods system up until 1971, when we couldn't pay everybody for all the dollars we'd printed up. Nixon went off the gold standard. We based then kind of on a faith that the U.S. Treasuries would be a backing for our currency, and it seems odd to have paper backing paper. But when we got to QE1, the Federal Reserve buying up toxic waste as the backing of our currency is absolutely to the point of insanity, that toxic waste mortgage-backed securities are now the backing of the issuance of paper currency to the tune of $1.5 trillion, leaves one just shaking their head.
Now, hold on. Are you suggesting that the dollar bills in my pocket are now backed by a subdivision in Las Vegas?
Perfect.
I just wanted to clear that up.
and it really is. I think I always go back to the Aesop fable that the emperor has no clothes. For some reason, by convention, we've continued to pass these paper slips around, dead presidents' pictures on them, or more importantly today, just digital bits in a computer somewhere started by the Federal Reserve, but anyway, as the credits and value of our wealth. Of course, it's a scoring system and therefore has some relative value in our continuing acceptance, but it's one of us passing the hot potato to the next. It's all a sham in some quote-unquote real sense, because all the currencies of the world are paper money. And my long-term view of that system is it will collapse, as have all fiat currencies forever, usually about once a generation for a major society. Fortunately, the dollar has lasted the second longest currency on the planet, only after the British pound. But I think all of them are vulnerable to major long-term inflation that will destroy them, and I'm claiming that within my lifetime. For that basic bias about the value of a dollar affects all my vision about investing, in the sense that I think as the paper and financial system collapses for real, when enough people stand up and say, "You mean the emperor doesn't have any clothes on?" Will happen. And the question is, what's the trigger events that bring some of that about? And we're seeing trigger events around the planet just as we speak.
Well, so if every generation or so, paper money sort of gets away from the handlers and becomes worthless, that's really a process of disconnection between the amount of money that's created and the underlying assets that are backing it, the productive economy, the things that are truly being produced. So if that's a normal sort of a rhythm that happens throughout history, let's turn our attention for a second to what happens when something a little bit bigger happens, which is that if we agree that it's really the goods and services that undergird the value of a dollar or any currency, what happens when the master resource, the one without which no goods and services can be produced at all, and I'm talking about energy now, what happens when we can throw some real prudent adult-sized concerns and questions about the ability of the energy infrastructure to continually grow? That's going down, I'm convinced, with peak oil, and now with this nuclear event in Japan. I think we have to scrap a whole lot of ideas around how much nuclear power we're going to be adding into the mix over the next few decades. When we put those two pieces together, I see an energy shortfall, and I see massive money printing happening. So when we talk about that gap between what's real and how you value it, that is your money, I feel that we're in an accelerating process for that gap to widen. How do you see it?
Boy, right on. Almost, you don't need to interview me because you've got it nailed, in my view, Chris. And let's add a few more background pieces. Your book nicely points out the wonderful chart I've used in talks about the finding of oil on the planet by decade. You've nice chart in your book, which will be coming out pretty soon, that says how much oil we have found in a decade compared to how much we are using in the decade. And up through the 1960s, we were finding significantly more oil than we were using. Those times were when we were finding reserves to eventually produce. Right now, we are finding about a third as much oil as we are using. That is clearly unsustainable. And if you look at the big picture, I usually give a talk which I title, They Aren't Making Any More Dinosaurs, based on the basic concept that natural fossil fuel sources of energy were laid down over a period of 100 million years, and we've just used up about half of that supply in the last 100 years, which is obviously using it up a lot faster than the dinosaurs are rotting. And we just combust it. We, oxygen combined with hydrocarbon and break it down into the atmosphere. That's the end of it. It doesn't come back. It's not like growing food where you come back and plant a crop next year. This is gone. We'll never have those complex hydrocarbons for constructing plastics or food, health, chemical, petrochemical feedstocks, and all the valuable things that they could be because they're nice molecules for chemical processes, because we just burn them up. But a little bit of a side, but just a big picture point of view, having used up that half of the planet's fossil fuels in 100, or in this case oil I'm particularly pointing to, in 100 years, one questions the future of humanity. I think you and I, Chris, have lived in the probably most abundant time for humanity, as all that energy has given us the wealth and the ability to create things that never existed. I came through the computer industry. I love what we've done with telecommunications, electronics. Steve Jobs grew up in the house across the street from where I raised my kids. He went to the same high school a little sooner than my kids, but I love the iPad that I purchased in the store waiting in line last spring, and I haven't gone to an iPad 2. But all of this depends on having a source of energy to take the work off of the backs of humans and horses or animals to grow our food, for example. Turn of the century, my dad was growing up on a farm in Ohio, a turn of the century ago. 50% of the people on the planet were eking out food, or in our own country. Now 3% of the people provide the food by driving tractors and having mechanization and having hybrid seeds and fertilizer, all of which depend on this energy source that has given us this abundance. And the reason I went into all that elaborate is to suggest that the life of the future, if we are in fact, as I think, likely to not be able to increase the quantity of energy produced, will limit the increase in wealth to spread around our human existence. In other words, our lifestyles probably will not grow for our children the way they did for us in terms of abundance. We have to face some real limitations of what the personal wealth and living styles will be as we go forward because of this very fundamental limitation of nature that the planet can only support so many human beings. We're not sure what that level is, but I don't think it's infinite growth anymore.
Yeah, and I think that narrative is just creeping in at the edges. I mean, for me, it's central to my life, and for thousands of people who happen to ascribe to that, it's central, but it's still not mainstream yet. And this is my chief concern. So if we turn to Japan for a second, I'm really concerned about the implications for the global economy that are embedded in the Japan story. And my concerns kind of go like this. I don't think the world is prepared for the world's third largest economy to violently shift from being a net exporter of both goods and, more importantly, liquidity and funding to a net consumer of both. So I mean, just think about, like, Japan has been like this. If it's been emanating anything for the past 2 decades, it's been like yen like crazy, and it's been taking their trade surpluses and recycling those back out. There's been a flow that's been established that's now about to just shift in the other direction. And, when we look at things like things that we just don't fundamentally know about, we don't know what $600 trillion of derivatives, most of them interest rate linked, a lot of them Forex linked. We don't know how those are going to behave with some sort of an insult like I'm talking about. And as well, there's a deeper story under this, kind of like when the Deepwater Horizon blew up. Yes, we said, so there's a primary story, which is about oil and oil exploration and risks. But there was a deeper story, which was about the limits of technology, which I think some people are still wrestling with internally. Like, what does this mean that our best efforts can sometimes be thwarted? That's not the story we want to be hearing right now. So when I look at this, I'm looking at Japan now as potentially a point of recognition at which a couple of things come due. One is that we can't, our growth story for next year is kind of shredded, but maybe something larger is shredded. Maybe the longer growth story, maybe it's not just next year. Maybe it's the year after that. And then also there's going to be some really violent perturbations as those capital flows reverse, the liquidity flows reverse. There's eddies standing up and swirling where there used to just be a nice, comfortable stream. And there's an element of all of this being just slightly out of control of the fiscal and monetary authorities in Japan. I could see that also spreading. It's like a Greece-like awareness moment, but at a much larger scale. What are your thoughts there?
Oh boy, I wish I could we're watching societal collapse there in Japan. I have a couple of email lists. There's panic in Tokyo. They would like to say, well, let's evacuate Tokyo. You can't evacuate Tokyo. 20 million people, you just can't move them at all. Yeah. There is no good answer. Let's start with the more simple one rather than we get to the financial one, which has not completely unfolded enough to say. But the energy piece of this, we really do have a very, very serious problem that we started with here, that we are going to at some point run out of fossil fuels and need an alternative. The most obvious alternative, certainly to oil, was coal, but out of fossil fuels was to a new form of energy, nuclear. And we have power plants across the planet. Although they haven't been being developed much recently, it looks like a good alternative to the limitations of fossil fuel. I think nuclear as an energy source is dead for a couple of decades from this disaster. What that means is, instead of building new nuclear plants to offload some of the required sources of energy, we will be decommissioning plants and fearful because of what's happening. Right now, it's not clear at all what's going to happen to Fukushima. They cannot get the workers in because the radiation levels are so high. They are flying helicopters over top, but even the helicopter pilots are getting contaminated. They're trying to squirt water from the distance. It looks like they're flailing with anything they can think of. At some point, this could match Chernobyl the flotsam and jetsam is there will be no nuclear plants. That puts more demand on perhaps natural gas to provide for, at least in the United States, electrical power generation, since we have a pretty good abundance of it and came up with this new fracking system to be able to provide greater supplies of it. I think that's kicking the can to some extent, in the sense that I don't see us being able to produce growth in energy at the level that the population of the planet, particularly Asia, wants to grow its economies. We cannot meet China's demands for growth as they industrialize, and there are some great convulsive collapses coming just through the demands of energy. All of this has been discussed without discussing the point I think you brought up, and we should do it, the financial piece of it. But just look at the problems of supplying the energy the world demands. We don't have the resources to do it.
Right. So let me just go on that for just a second, because China from 2000 to 2009, they doubled their energy consumption. And of course, this is across everything.
And more than doubled their imports, because they are a sizable, if not an overwhelming producer.
Right.
The world traded piece of energy is, I'm interrupting a little, but the sideline is worth it because it's an area most people don't realize, is net energy exported by these countries that are big exporters is significantly less than the growth of their internal production, because they use it themselves. I'm thinking particularly of the Middle East, where population growth is exponential, and therefore the net exported energy is not growing by a factor significantly less than the production, which also isn't growing. I don't know if you know Jeffrey Brown's work on
yeah, sure, I've met him.
Land export model. Have you know Jeff?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, I'm just inserting that it's worse than we think it is.
well, we have exponential collapse of exports because it's being eaten from both ends. First, production declines in most countries, with very few exceptions, and then also
North Sea, Cantorell. We
all
can
this.
Go through the litany. Yes.
Yes, and then consumption increases also on a percentage basis. So when you have a percentage decline in production being met on the other side by a percentage increase in consumption, that's a double exponential whammy to exports. Because your exports, it's the difference between production and consumption. And so the really vital point, to circle back really quick, is around, I know that there are nuclear plant designs today that I'm actually reasonably comfortable with, but I happen to live about 20 miles from a nuclear plant that has the exact same design as Fukushima's. Right, it's one of these GE toroids.
Boiler water reactor. Yeah.
Yep, it's there it is, and it's right at the end of its design life, and literally the day before the Fukushima incident started, it was recertified by the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, and guess what? The people of Vermont are very unhappy with that, and it'll get contested. Point being that I think that even if we build nuclear plants of these new pebble bed designs or other designs as fast as we can, they'll probably just be replacing the ones like the one near my house, which I bet you now gets decommissioned. So even if we build plants as fast as we can, on a net basis, we're probably not looking, on a best case, I think we're looking at a net zero from nuclear for a long time. But, decade.
That's the optimistic story. I agree with you. And I think we should. I'm not as fearful as maybe I've suggested that our public will be after this particular problem unravels and we see what the result is, or they have a sarcophagus in Fukushima. I would ask just a little bit, though, and you said a net zero as a result. If you think about what we need for energy, I think the number's like 15 trillion
yeah, that one.
It requires something like 15,000 nuclear reactors to meet it. We can't do it just with nuclear. We need many more sources of energy. The only ones that are sort of, we'll call it creation or renewable, are solar. But everything, and you have a chapter on this, all these things added together, from ethanol to switchgrass to mirrors to photovoltaic to tides to geothermal, don't amount to enough to make a difference, even when added together. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying on all of them. And I think one that probably will work in probably a backward way is conservation, because, in fact, we are somewhat egregious, particularly in the United States, in our usage. We are doing some things to insulate houses better and maybe drive smaller cars, but by and large, we haven't hit the wall in the normal cultural methods that could make a difference of conservation. But that will happen when the price of a gallon of gasoline hits $10, not necessarily just because we're all good guys trying to help the planet of our friend and neighbor.
And here's the thing. Conservation is absolutely the number one thing we can and should be doing. It's a
Agreed.
no-brainer.
I just want to emphasize that with a big agreed. Yes, go on.
And here's the thing I can't figure out. How do you create more debt through conservation?
I haven't quite thought of it that way.
That's the hitch in the story.
To create debt and is creating debt and will do so. But I think of them somewhat separately linked. Now, what's your method of linking them together?
Well, here's the thing. I just have this view that unless our economy is growing, by which I mean unless our debt is constantly expanding, prior debts can't be serviced. So there has to be a story which says we have to continually be increasing our debts. Conservation, to flip over to this other side of the story, is absolutely the right thing to be doing on every dimension except one. You can't support the expansion of debt through conservation. I haven't figured out how to do it yet because conservation is fundamentally about not creating. It's about not using something. And so that's why I think we're not even looking at it in this country, because it doesn't support our dominant narrative, which is this is who we are. We are a nation of consumers. We have a growth story. We link prosperity and growth. We want that story to continue going. Conservation doesn't fit into that story. It has no place. It's the odd man out, and it gets pushed on the sofa at the corner of the party. This is, I think that we still have a really big disconnect between what we should be doing and what we're still trying to do, because we're just fundamentally have the wrong narrative in our heads. I look at what happened at Deepwater first, at Fukushima second, at who knows what third, maybe Bahrain. All of these things are around telling us something about our energy infrastructure, about the role of energy. And the warning, if we're going to heed it, I think, is to say, wow, something has shifted. What do we have to do to prepare for that? What should we be doing differently? What should we stop doing? What new things should we be doing? There's all kinds of stuff that comes up from that, but only if you have the right story. So long as we have this other story playing, which is, what we really need is we need to get people working again and our economy growing before we can have that conversation. So we're going to support QE 1, 2, 3, QE 18, I think is how Mark Faber put it on TV the other day.
I saw that interview.
So we're going to just keep trying the things that don't work, definition of insanity, all of that, right? And so I'm just wondering, like, from your position, what is it going to take for us as a nation or maybe as a globe to start really getting I'm not saying we have the right story. I'm saying this story deserves a place at the table, though. What will it take, A, to get that place at the table, and B, what are you seeing with the people you work with in terms of number of people who are now getting it, from different sectors and parts of society?
Boy, I wish I had a simple, clean answer to it all.
Yeah, me too.
I can't. Let me try a few little pieces. We at Casey Research do have a pretty good reading through multiple newsletters, and we put on conferences. I'll be speaking in Boca Raton. Unfortunately, the conference is now sold out at the end of April. The title of my speech will be Economy, Empire, and Energy. Not a little unlike your book with 3 E's, different E's, but they're talking about some of the same things. And you mentioned Mark Faber. He also spoke at our conference in Las Vegas a couple years ago, and had a chance to chat with him a little bit afterwards. But anyway, we do have people that get it, was my starting point. We have even something called Casey Files, where we get together as local groups. People just trade ideas that are typically subscribers just want to chat with other friends and subscribers around to try and pass the words around. But let's back up a little bit as to what's going on here. Some of this has been done before. Certainly fiat currency collapse and how we get there. We're on just the standard old path everybody's been on. Mm-hmm. This is going to happen sort of regardless of what happens to everything else. Governments have the ability to print up money, take the advantage of it for themselves, and the incentives are all there for the politicians to print up more money. It keeps them in office, and therefore we can expect more and destruction of our currency eventually. That'll happen with or without the destruction of energy sources and the world competition which I call resource wars, which is what I think is going on in the Middle East. In other words, we're fighting over their oil.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that will continue, and I think we're losing that battle is the problem I see. Gaddafi is winning. I don't know who created and fomented the protests and what's going on. And Saudi Arabia backing up the Bahrain government because they don't want Shiite Muslims in their eastern territories to want to break away from a Saudi type. Saudi is a tribe, shall we say, of Arabians, not necessarily a country. It's a funny name.
Mm-hmm.
We put them in power. We said, you run the country, and we'll support you, give you your military, you buy our treasuries. This is a game that has worked for 40 years pretty successfully for us, but there's limitations that are breaking out across the planet. I got a little off track. The track I want to get to is the E called empire. We are a late-stage empire, in my view. I think we would learn more about our future from studying the Romans than we would from trying to figure out a technology, which we should, to replace fossil fuels for energy source. Hopefully we do all that. But I think to some extent, I'm watching the collapse of our great nation from a view that it's almost inevitable. I don't have any confidence at all that the people in Washington know what they're doing or are going to fix it. I wish I were more optimistic, but the reason I bring this up is that I suggest that we as individuals have to protect ourselves, particularly against the most immediate one of currency collapse and a new sovereign debt crisis coming. I don't know when that'll happen or how it'll get trivial or will unravel, but that's kind of the subject of, well, your book and mine in terms of how do people, once they recognize this, get a little farther along that road of survival, recognizing that perhaps our children are not going to have to be able to live a lot better than we did, as was the case for most of the country from colonial times to now. I think it's going to be a decrease in lifestyles unless you are a little ahead of the wave to understand how to protect at least yourself.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm in complete agreement. I think my view of the economy, it's a complex system, therefore it's inherently unpredictable. Even simple complex systems, if I can use that term, are unpredictable. And this is a complex system. And so we don't know
Is that like an unknown?
It is.
To quote
I'm going
Rumsfeld, who was quoting McNamara.
I went Rumsfeldian on you there. So, but so we don't know the timing, and this is one of the central themes that I continually push. Is I do not, and I have never tried to set myself up as a guru who says on this date that will happen. Follow me. I'm just classifying risks. You know, my background is as a scientist. Came out of neurotoxicology. That's a branch of pathology. Everything's risks to me. That's it, right? And so I want to try and control and mitigate risks as much as possible. And what I see are accumulating, not decreasing risks. I see QE as accumulating more pressure that's pushing on the dollar, which someday, eventually, like all fiat currencies, will give way. Is that tomorrow? Is that 20 years from now? Is it 200 years? I really don't know. But what I do know is that when you pile up risk after risk after risk, what you are doing is you are increasing the chance that you're going to have a big event, right? It's like the quake in Japan. The subduction zone is like just grinding away and it's not releasing. And the longer it doesn't release, the more violent the actual release when it comes. I can feel these pressures building, whether it's in the fiscal policies. I mean, but if you had told me, Chris, 5 years ago, you're saying, Chris, in 5 years' time, the U.S. government is going to be running $1.6 trillion deficits year after year, and the Federal Reserve is going to be monetizing that, and the dollar is mostly going to be fairly quiet. I would have said you're nuts.
Me too.
But
in
here
fact,
we are.
I did that scenario and said I thought $400 billion was some sort of a impossibly high deficit level when it first came out of the Bush administration.
Yeah.
And guess what? You know, it's now 4 times higher. The system hasn't broken. Yes, I was in more. I have to say that's the one area where I'm absolutely amazed. I think though we have had pretty large increases in prices. We got 1.6% PPI yesterday or something like that, including food and energy, which of course should be included. I'm getting a little detailed here, but yes, we are not that far from potential financial collapse.
Right,
But
the pressures
listen,
are up.
you're a technologist, I am too. I think that humanity isn't going to die off. I think we are going to have some optimism for our future, particularly through the technology side of things. We will figure out pebble reactors. We will figure out how to use solar energy. We will use some of the technologies that are absolutely fabulous in communications and computers that came through the generation that is now kind of slipping beside. But the new kids are picking this up faster than I would have imagined possible. There are some optimistic aspects, particularly through some of the new technologies. My son is getting a degree using the words complex systems, PhD at Oxford right now. We have these great discussions about how things connect up more or less around social networking and things like that. But these are things I never dreamed of when I started in the computer industry, and give us some sense of potential optimism. I think I'm more optimistic about our youth finding new ideas than I am about our old politicians kicking the can down the road about our financial system. I fully expect complete financial collapse, but fortunately, financial collapse doesn't kill people like a World War III. What I hope is we don't move towards, armed conflict on a massive scale that would destroy humanity, might save a planet's environment, but it wouldn't be too good for society. Well, those are kind of extreme. Maybe we should be careful about even talking about terms like that. But my point would be, let's leave some slivers of significant optimism through technology, new energy sources, new communications ways of dealing with ourselves on the planet, and maybe even social organization structure of maybe not using the nation state as our central focal point, but local communities and better understanding of humans between humans on a broader scale with better communication to be our organizing roles in the future in what is clearly a very complex system, namely human society and our relationship to our planet.
I really, you've raised an incredibly important point for me, which is that a lot of what I do is really first I do shake people up a little bit and say, listen, things are really about to change. And a very, very common, very understandable first response of people is to say, oh my God, that's really making me anxious or fearful, or there's an element of gloom and doom to this, which I don't like, right? So that's okay. That emotion settles out. And then we can have the second part of the discussion, which is, listen, this is just about change. It's change that's happening whether we want it to or not. But if you can foresee it, you have the opportunity to mitigate the risks, alter things early on, and actually I see enormous opportunities in this story, just huge opportunities. Many of them are quite different from the past opportunities. That's the point of all the work I do, is I just want to illuminate the path a little bit so that people can say, wow, if I can see this change coming just a little bit ahead of time, I will be able to actually maybe even do quite well. So I've personally cut my standard of living in half, but our quality of life has increased. That's one example. Another example, I went wholesale into gold and silver in 2003, and I have people tell me today, yeah, but that was an easy decision to make then. Look at how lower it was. And I'm like, no.
Nothing's an easy decision.
No, that was a hard decision. That was one of the hardest decisions I ever had to make. There were people at the time telling me, that what few people were talking about gold, that it's a hated thing, that you're going to be fighting the Fed, it's already in a bubble, you could lose all your money, it's a volatile, all this stuff.
20 years of decline.
All of that. It was a horrible decision. And so today, people look at it and say, buying gold at 1,400 or silver at 34, this is just, it's too hard of a decision. I'm like, yep, it's always hard. And but if you can make the decision, I made that decision based on the idea formed back then, which was a little bit crudely formed compared to today, but here it was, that I thought that my government was just going to keep printing. And I thought that was how they were going to respond to all the things I saw coming. It turned out to be the right course of action. I still see that same dynamic in play in spades. I don't see anything to change me off of that particular story at this time. So there's tremendous opportunities here for people to protect, preserve, even grow their wealth, to do things that most people won't be doing, which is where the discomfort comes in for a lot of people. But still, I think figuring out the trajectory we're on is not that hard. The U.S. is going to have a fiscal crisis at some point. I don't know what's going to trigger it. I don't know if it's going to be this Japan event with liquidity sucking out. All of a sudden, Treasury market starts to see yields shooting up. That triggers a fiscal crisis. I don't know, right? It'll be something like that. And these narratives are getting closer and closer. These stories, these I saw this great. I'm just in search of a white swan now, bud. And we're surrounded. There's a whole flock of black swans, right? I mean, you check off all these things on the list. It's incredible what we're facing right now with Japan representing multiple black swans, with what's going on with oil, with what's going on in the Middle East, with the fiscal stuff. It's amazing. All I know is that these are all risks, and people should protect themselves against these risks if they can, and they should do that. And that the decisions won't be easy that they have to make. Do you go into this in your book, Profiting from the World's Economic Crisis? The title is quite progressive.
Well, I certainly talk about the financial situation. My book covers both my theories of how the world works and then got fairly specific into making investment recommendations, which would be very much in line with the kinds of things we've been talking about here of energy and precious metals and being fearful about the currencies of the world. That almost seems secondary because what I sensed in the last pieces of what you were talking about, Chris, and it sort of drew me to you personally, is that this is sort of a personal life work. It is for me. It started as a major shift in career to dedicate my life to these sorts of things and a few more things on the fringe that you just can't get to in an hour, half-hour discussion like we've had here. But I felt warmed by that what do I call it, personal story of yours that matches mine of trying to be almost taking a cause of trying to explain to the world what the world is that we're living in, to wake up and at least understand what's going on, if not necessarily change other people's lifestyles, but hopefully to improve the planet a little bit by just describing it. So, yeah, sure, your book, my book, we are soulmates in some sense in this quest, shall I say, even if it is a little quixotic, to try and explain to the world how important these things are, and hopefully that maybe the world itself will improve itself as it understands the risks and problems here. And certainly as people become aware of it, they can hopefully live their own lives in a way that works a little better.
Yeah, well said. Let's create a world worth inheriting. It's I
like it.
We're on a path that needs changing. So when's a good time to change? Well, sooner. It's better than later. So that's the path I'm on. This has just been a fabulous, illuminating conversation. I really want to thank you for your time. I'm hoping we can do it again at some point. We've just scratched the surface, and I know that world events are going to give us plenty of fodder for the cannon as we go forward here. So really, thank you a lot. Again, your book is Profiting from the World's Economic Crisis, and your work with Casey Research is just fabulous. So thank you again. Really appreciate this conversation.
Great talking to you, Chris, and it's fun to have somebody who really understands it on the other side of the line when doing these things. 3-minute sound bites for Maria Bartiromo really don't get it for me. Appreciate the chance to chat. Good luck with all the work.
All right, and thank you. And this is your host, Chris Martenson, and we're signing off on another chrismartenson.com podcast. Good day.
This concludes this podcast by Chris Martenson. To gain further insight into where things stand today and what might happen tomorrow, please visit chrismartenson.com. That's ChrisMartenson.com. Please join Chris Martenson next time to continue your journey toward awareness, understanding, and action.